I survived the Great Alaska Earthquake, 1964, Chapter 11. The next day, Friday, March 27th, 1964. Mom, Dad, and Uncle Solly rushed through breakfast. Even though school was closed for Good Friday, they still had work to do on the house they were building. Jackson planned to spend the day doing chores for Uncle Solly. He hadn't slept well last night. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he heard the kids' voices from the playground. He hates us. That kid's weird. Maybe he'd like us if we had fur and tails. Hopefully, shoveling snow and splitting wood would help him clear his head. Jackson, Uncle Solly said as he was putting on his boots. You remember that ship that's coming in this afternoon? The Chena? Jackson nodded. How could he forget? I need you to go to the loading dock and get a note to my buddy in the crew. I'm not going to make it down to see him tonight. We're going to be working late at the house. Sure, Jackson said. Going down to the dock was the last thing Jackson wanted to do. Every kid in his class would be on that dock, but he couldn't say no to Uncle Solly. He'd just have to avoid the kids. Uncle Solly scrawled a note and handed it to Jackson. Just give it to any of the sailors you see, he said. Get there around 5:30. Would the kids be gone by then? Jackson hoped so. At 5:15, Jackson grabbed his backpack and headed down to the waterfront. It was barely a 5-minute walk. To distract himself, Jackson thought of all the fun times he had had with Uncle Solly over the years. Heading out of the harbor in Uncle Solly's little boat, they'd explored the coves and bays tucked between the mountains. There was always something to see. A walrus with dagger tusks, dolphins dancing in the waves, furry sea otters floating on rafts they made from kelp. Best of all was the humpback whale Jackson spotted a couple of years ago. It broke the surface of the bay, a massive creature more than 50 feet long. Water shot out of the blowhole on its back before it sank down again. A moment later, it exploded up out of the water. Arching its back, it seemed to hover in the air before disappearing in a shimmering splash that drenched Jackson and Uncle Solly. Jackson's chest tightened as he thought of those happy summer days. He wondered what Lenore would have said about that whale, or how Nora would have described it. Did Mary know any songs about whales? And what kind of joke would Chris have told to crack them all up? Jackson would never know. Why should he care? Jackson pulled his parka tighter around him as a bitter wind blew from the harbor. At least it wasn't snowing. Jackson came to the end of Alaska Avenue. Just ahead of him was the waterfront. It was like a separate little town sitting right on the harbor. Different docks, warehouses for fish and cargo, a salmon cannery where fish were cut up and packed into cans. Jackson could see the Chena floating with its right side up against the main loading dock. It was at least 10 times as long as the humpback whale. Jackson crossed a busy street and stepped onto a bridge that headed out over the water to the docks. Uncle Solly had been right. At least half of the town was here. Cars were parked up and down the street. Kids skipped past Jackson, their parents chasing behind. A truck rumbled by, and the bridge shook. Jackson stepped off the bridge and onto the main loading dock. Dock workers lugged crates into the warehouse. A forklift zipped past. Jackson walked slowly toward the ship, reaching into his pocket for Uncle Solly's note. He looked around, but he didn't see any sailors to give it to. The only sailor he could see was above him, on the deck of the Chena. The man was leaning over the railing, smiling down at a group of little kids gathering below. "Who wants an apple?" he sang. "I do!" cried a little girl in her pink hat. The man tossed the fruit down. "Got She clutched the apple to her chest like it was a gold nugget. "How about a chocolate bar?" the man called. "Me, me!" a little boy squealed. Jackson watched until he spotted a sailor leaving the ship. Jackson hurried over to him and asked if he could deliver the note. "Happy to," the sailor said. Jackson thanked him and darted away. Now he could get out of here. But halfway across the bridge, Jackson spotted 4 kids walking toward him. Without a second look, he knew it was Lenore, Chris, Nora, and Mary. They were all laughing. Lenore gave Chris a playful push. Mary and Nora linked their arms together and skipped ahead. Jackson remembered those scampering wolf pups he'd watched from the cliff last summer. That's what these kids reminded him of, a wolf pack. He felt an ache in his chest, a lonely kind of ache. Wait, did he want to be part of their pack of kids? No, he thought, pushing the idea away. It was better to be on his own. But then why did he want to rush over to them? Get a grip, Jackson thought. Those kids didn't want to see him. They hated him, right? Jackson slipped behind a parked car and squatted down behind it. He'd wait until they were out of sight and then hurry home, just like he'd planned. As Jackson watched the kids walk by, those wolves popped back into his mind. He remembered their ferocious growls and snarls when the grizzly appeared. He could practically hear them. Grrr. The sound got louder. Grrr. But wait, that wasn't the sound in his mind. It was all around him. What was happening? Jackson's body started to tremble. But no, it wasn't just his body shaking. Everything was shaking. Suddenly, a woman screamed, "Earthquake!" Chapter 12. All at once, everyone who had been heading toward the docks rushed back towards the street. People screamed. Parents scooped up their children. Cars slammed on their brakes. Jackson started to stand up to join the rush. His heart was beating a mile a minute, but then he squatted back down. Earthquakes happen all the time, he reminded himself. There were more earthquakes here in Alaska than anywhere in the lower 48 states, even California. In the bush, the ground would suddenly start shaking. Trees would sway. Rabbits would dart out of their underground tunnels. Once, some jars of moose meat fell from their kitchen shelves and shattered onto the floor. But that was the worst earthquake damage Jackson had ever seen. He braced himself against the parked car, expecting the earthquake to stop at any moment. It didn't. The roaring got louder. The shaking got harder. Louder, harder, louder, harder. The water in the harbor began to churn and froth like an evil witch's brew. Waves sloshed across the bridge. Fishing boats in the harbor bounced around like toys. The chaina strained against its thick ropes. Louder, harder, louder, harder. The bridge was shaking so violently now that Jackson was bouncing up and down like a ball. His backpack slammed into his head over and over again. He braced himself against the car and glanced around for the other kids. Where had they gone? Hopefully off the bridge and back onto the street, which was where Jackson had to go. He managed to stumble to the street, but then he fell again. And this time it was impossible to stand back up. The earth seemed to be alive, rising and falling and twisting and rolling. Jackson felt he was trying to crawl across the back of a furious, thrashing monster. Louder, harder, louder, harder. Crash! The wooden building on the corner collapsed into a heap. Boom! The telephone pole fell to the ground, dragging down wires that sparked and hissed like flaming snakes. Screams rose above the roar, and then came a sound so loud Jackson was sure his ears would explode. Whoosh! People had stopped running and crawling and were staring back toward the loading dock. The chaina seemed to be sinking. and the buildings and docks were crumbling apart and sliding into the harbor. Jackson couldn't understand what he was looking at. Somehow the land was caving in, pouring into the harbor. But how was that possible? Jackson sat there on the ground, blinking hard. None of this could be real. But every time he opened his eyes, more of the waterfront was gone. The warehouse, the cannery, the cars and trucks. And it wasn't just the waterfront in front of him. Looking up and down the coast, all the land along the water seemed to be melting away. Louder, harder, louder, harder. Jackson slammed his eyes shut. He couldn't watch. He had to get away. And now, through his swirl of panic, all he could think of was Mom and Dad and Uncle Solly. He started crawling across the street. He'd made it halfway across when, crack, a massive gash opened up in the ground right in front of him. A fissure! Jackson had read about these giant splits in the earth. Never in his life did he think he would see one. He peered down into the blackness. How deep was it? And what was down there? He didn't want to know. He just wanted to get away. He quickly spun around. Crack! Another gash yawned open. Crack! Jackson sat there, frozen in fear. A sickening stench huffed at him from the earth's open jaws. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying not to imagine what was down there. But his mind flashed with nightmare pictures. Bubbling, burning lava, shooting flames, the wide open jaws of a flesh-eating beast. He felt the ground beneath him start to give way. No, no, no! But down Jackson went screaming into the darkness. Chapter 13. Oomph! Jackson landed on his side on soft, wet sand. The stench made him gag, but his backpack had broken his fall. There was no boiling lava, no flames. He was not inside the mouth of a slobbering beast. He was at the bottom of a narrow pit. It was very dark and everything was still shaking. But peering up, Jackson could see the street. He guessed he'd only fallen about 6 feet. Might as well be 100 feet, Jackson thought, because there was no way to get out. He stretched out his arms, feeling the jagged sides. If a fissure could open up, could it also slam shut? Could he be crushed? He had to get out of here, but how? He started to take off his backpack. Maybe he could signal with his flashlight, or use his rope to somehow pull himself up. Except, before he could get it off, freezing water started to seep up from the ground, soaking his boots. And then, whoosh! Jackson screamed as a blast of freezing water exploded underneath him. A spray so powerful, it rocketed him up out of the pit. It was like being shot through the blowhole of a huge whale. The water knocked the air from his lungs. It gushed into his mouth and up his nose. And then, with a sickening crunch of his ankle, his body landed on the hard, wet street. Pain exploded from the tips of his toes to the top of his leg. He lay there, too dazed to think. It took him a long moment to realize that the roaring had stopped. The ground was still. Finally, the earthquake was over. Gritting his teeth against the pain in his leg, Jackson managed to sit himself up. He was on the side of the street. Hunks of icy snow mixed with giant rocks had been coughed up from under the ground. Towers of water blasted up some of the cracks. The water was brown and smelled rotten, like an outhouse on a hot day. Jackson tried not to think of what was in the water that he had swallowed.
A man rushed by him carrying a crying little boy in his arms. A woman limped past. He didn't see Lenore or Chris or Nora or Mary. Had they made it off the bridge in time? Were they safe? Jackson turned and stared in horror at the harbor, blinking in disbelief. Everything that had been there minutes before was gone. All the docks and buildings, all the people who hadn't made it over the bridge in time. The Chaina had broken free of its ropes and was drifting in the harbor, except it wasn't a harbor anymore. It was a swirling sea of wreckage. Everything that had been on the docks was now part of a wild whirlpool. Everything and everyone. Panic tore at Jackson's insides. Where were Mom and Dad and Uncle Solly? He had to find them now. They were at the house they were building. But where was that? Jackson didn't know, and even if he did, he couldn't get there. His ankle was broken for sure. The pain was sickening. He could feel it swelling up inside his boot. There was no way he could walk or even stand. A hopeless feeling came over Jackson. His mind started to swirl. Big hot tears hung in the corners of Jackson's eyes. He tried to brush them away. Be tough, he scolded himself. Get to work. But his panic only grew. Get to work. And he said the words over and over to himself. But they just spun around in his mind like the wreckage churning in the harbor. Because what could he do? Mom and Dad had never prepared him for anything like this. He dragged himself out of the icy puddle where he'd landed. Sucking in his breath and fighting tears, he crawled slowly off the street and into a building that was somehow still standing. He sat there shivering, his soaked backpack next to him. A strange sound came out of his mouth. Not a scream, not a sob. It was a weak, rasping cry. It reminded him of a sound he'd heard before on the night of the cabin fire. The winter bear had made that sound. The winter bear. Now Jackson understood how that bear had felt when it let loose that horrible cry. Lost, terrified, totally alone. Chapter 14. And then Jackson heard voices, familiar voices calling his name. Jackson! Lenore? Jackson, where are you? Chris? No, Jackson must be hearing things. But the voices got louder, closer. Jackson! Mary? Nora? Jackson slid out from the doorway. His heart rose at the sight of the 4 kids. They were just down the street, peering into buildings, looking for someone. Looking for Jackson? I'm right here, he shouted. In a flash, they were all around him, crouching down, hovering close. Jackson stared at their faces, which were streaked with dirt and tears. He knew he must look the same. We were looking for you, Lenore said in a ragged voice. Her hair was matted with dirt. We saw you fall into that crack, said Chris. Blood oozed from a deep cut on his cheek. We were so scared, Nora said. We were praying that you got out, and you did, said Mary. Jackson just stared at them, amazed. But his relief quickly faded when he saw the look of fear on Lenore's face. We have to get you out of here, she said breathlessly. People are saying there's going to be a tsunami. Tsunamis, massive waves that often happened after earthquakes. Jackson looked around at the shattered ground, at the collapsed buildings. This was nothing compared to what a powerful tsunami could do. A tsunami could swallow up everything and everyone that was left at Valdez. Come on, Lenore said, holding out her hand. But Jackson shook his head. I can't walk, he said. My ankle's broken. He swallowed hard. You should go. Each person needed to take care of themselves, right? Chris turned around so that his back was to Jackson. He was ready to run away from there. Of course he is, Jackson thought, but he didn't take off. He lowered himself down right in front of Jackson. You can ride on my back, he said. The next thing Jackson knew, Lenore and Mary had taken hold of his arms. They gently pulled him up. Nora held his back so he wouldn't fall. Keeping his weight off his crushed ankle, Jackson managed to stand long enough to get himself up onto Chris's back. Hold on tight, Lenore said, looping her arm around Jackson's to help hold him up. As they headed away from the harbor, Jackson turned and saw his backpack lying on the ground. Wait, he started to say, but he stopped himself. There wasn't time to go back. And besides, what he needed right now wasn't in that backpack. He tightened his grip on Chris. He looked at Lenore. He felt Mary's hand and Nora's hand on his back. And together, they ran for their lives. Chapter 15, about 4 months later, Monday, August 10th, 1964, 120 miles north of Valdez, near the Copper River. Jackson gripped his fishing pole, gave it a jiggle. Drops of sweat trickled down his back. It was very hot today, 50 degrees. He shouldn't have worn his flannel shirt, but it was still a perfect summer day in the bush. Birds chattered from the trees. An eagle soared overhead. Jackson breathed in the familiar summer smells. Pine, wildflowers, river, water. He looked proudly at the bucket of fish he'd caught for dinner, and then he spotted something moving just across the river. A very large animal. A grizzly. Jackson's whole body tensed, but then he relaxed. It was summer, he reminded himself. That bear had plenty of food. The river was wide and deep here, the water rushing fast. Grizzlies were good swimmers, but there was no reason for that bear to make a dangerous journey to cross. Still, Jackson backed away slowly. He kept his eyes on the bear as he crouched down behind a bush. He sucked in his breath as a flash of pain shot through his ankle. It had mostly healed, thanks to 2 surgeries in the hospital in Anchorage. But it still ached sometimes. Jackson watched the bear through the bushes. It was small, but looked healthy. Its light brown fur was thick and glossy. Jackson's mouth dropped open when he noticed that part of the grizzly's ear was missing. A chill ran up his spine. Could it be? The bear turned and Jackson saw a patch of bare flesh on its back. The skin looked scarred, like it had been burned. His eyes widened and his heart sped up. It's you, Jackson thought. The winter bear. Jackson watched in awe as the bear drank from the river. It lifted its big head and looked around. It was enjoying this bright day, just like Jackson was. And then it turned and trotted off into the woods. Jackson barely noticed the tears rolling down his cheeks. That bear had been through so much. But here it was, strong and healthy, just like Jackson. He'd made it through the most powerful earthquake in United States history. The quake had wrecked parts of downtown Anchorage and towns and villages across Alaska. Monster tsunamis smashed into the Kodiak, Seward, and the Whittier. The worst was in the small village of Chenega. A wall of water more than 70 feet high practically wiped the village off the earth. Luckily, the waves that hit Valdez after the quake were just a few feet high. They flooded the downtown, but by the worst, they flooded the downtown, but by then the worst was over, and Jackson and the other kids were safe in Miss Lawrence's car. She'd spotted them as they hurried up Alaska Avenue. She'd driven them out of town, zigzagging around fissures and fallen telephone poles, stopping to pick up other dazed and bloody people. They wound up at a campsite about 6 miles from town. Dozens of other people from Valdez had fled to that spot too. People were terrified that other waves would strike, or aftershocks, strong jolts that would destroy the buildings already weakened by the first quake. Jackson's chest got tight as he thought about that long night. He walked back to the river and splashed his face with cold river water. But more memories came flooding back. The ear-splitting roar of the quake that rang in his ears for days. The desperate voices of people calling out for their children, their parents, their friends. The angry glow of the fires that erupted in Valdez when giant oil tanks exploded. Worst of all was the terror of thinking he might never see Mom or Dad or Uncle Solly again. One by one, the kids' families had all appeared at the campsite, but by 10 o'clock that night, Jackson was still waiting in Miss Lawrence's car. She never left his side, never let go of his hand. And then finally, there they were, 3 faces peering through the window of Miss Lawrence's car. The next thing Jackson knew, he was in Mom's arms with Dad and Uncle Solly huddled close. They explained how Uncle Solly's car had been crushed by a tree. They'd walked for hours looking for Jackson. "We would have walked forever to find you," Mom had said. Jackson stepped back from the river and wiped his face with the bottom of his shirt. He took a deep breath and wiped away another round of tears. No use trying to hold them back. Lately, Jackson had realized that even tough people cried sometimes. Even tough people had nightmares and wanted their moms to stay with them until they fell back to sleep. Even tough people froze in panic when a rumble of thunder reminded them of an earthquake. Even tough people needed a friend to carry them when they were too hurt to walk on their own. Jackson stood there until the swirl of memories faded away. Then he started to pack up his fishing gear. It was getting late. Mom and Dad would be expecting him. Wait until they heard about the winter bear. They didn't blame the bear for what happened in the cabin. Neither did Jackson. Not anymore. He understood that the creature had just been looking for food. Mom and Dad would be happy to know that the bear was healthy and strong. It meant the bear wouldn't go looking for food at people's cabins again. Not that Jackson or Mom or Dad would ever have to worry about a cabin, because they weren't rebuilding theirs. They were leaving the bush for good. They decided together that they belonged in Valdez, with Uncle Solly, with their friends. This trip to the bush was just a visit. They'd come for only 2 weeks. Tomorrow they were heading back to Valdez. The waterfront was gone. Parts of the town were still badly damaged, and a lot of people had left for good, like Nora, who was living in Juneau now. She wrote letters to Jackson every week, and Mary, who had moved with her family to Seattle. Jackson missed both of them. But Lenore's and Chris's families had stayed. Miss Lawrence, too. Uncle Solly, of course, and plenty of others. They were all working together to rebuild the town, but not in the same place. In the weeks after the earthquake, scientists came to Valdez. They discovered why all the land along the coast had crumbled away. It turned out it wasn't really land. It was a mix of sand and water. When the shaking started, it melted away into the sea. The town's new spot was 4 miles up the coast, where the ground was solid rock. Valdez will rise up again, Uncle Solly had said with his usual pride, and it will be even better than before. Jackson picked up his rod and his bucket of fish. He gazed out over the river into the forest. He thought of all the lessons he'd learned growing up here. Most of all, he'd learned how to take care of himself. Most of all, he'd learned how to take care of himself. But the earthquake had taught Jackson another lesson, that he needed other people, too. He didn't want to be like a grizzly, a fierce creature living alone. He wanted to be like a wolf, part of a pack. Jackson took one last look around and started back towards the campsite. He loved this wild and beautiful land, and he'd miss living here. But he'd be back to visit, he knew. And the next time, maybe he'd bring his friends. The end.